I've spent my whole life working toward a single goal. You could say it's been my driving force, the thing that kept me going through both good and bad times. My name is Edward Barnes, and I've worked in the family business for over 60 years now. If anyone was set to take over, it was always going to be me. Or so I thought. When I first started out in the company, it was just a small operation. My father, Robert Barnes, had built the business from the ground up. It wasn't much more than a handful of employees back then, working out of a cramped office. But he had big plans, and over the years, I watched him turn that little startup into a multi-million-dollar tech company. It was incredible, honestly. The dedication, the long hours he put in. He didn't just want success for himself. He wanted to make something lasting. I admired that about him. Growing up, I always believed that I would one day take his place. I mean, who else could? I was his son, after all, and I'd been groomed for this role from the beginning. I started working here at 22 after finishing my degree in business administration. Dad always said, if you want to understand the company, you have to live it, breathe it. And that's exactly what I did. I spent countless hours on the floor with the engineers, learning about the products we sold, the clients we served, and the challenges we faced in an ever-changing industry. My dedication didn't go unnoticed. Over time, I moved up the ranks. First, I was managing the operations side of things, handling the logistics and supply chain. Then, I moved into sales, where I really started to make a name for myself. I brought in some big accounts, some of the company's most profitable deals. I remember the pride I felt the first time I landed that Fortune 500 client. That was a game changer. It wasn't just about the deal, it was about proving to my father that I could carry the company forward just like he had done. As I worked my way up, I began to see things a little differently. My dad had been a tough boss, not the kind of guy you could casually hang around with after hours. He kept things professional, but he made sure everyone knew that he was in charge. I admired him for it, even if it was tough sometimes. He taught me everything I knew about leadership. Never settle for less, always push for excellence, and above all, never show weakness. I think that's what made him successful, his determination, his grit. But as the years passed and I moved closer to the point where I knew the company would be handed over to me, I began to feel a certain pressure building. I knew the time was coming when I'd have to step up. At first, I didn't think much of it. Dad had always talked about the future, about how he'd eventually retire, how it was all part of the natural order. It was always assumed that I'd be the one to take over. I had worked for it after all. It was the next logical step. Around the time I turned 55, though, I started to notice some shifts in how my father was operating. Subtle things at first. He started leaning on a younger generation of employees. He began spending more time with his new assistant, Sarah. She was in her early 20s and had only joined the company a few years earlier. She was smart, no doubt, but she didn't have the same experience or history with the company that I did. Still, I could see how my father was beginning to trust her more and more. She had a way about her, charming, efficient, and quick on her feet. But something about it didn't sit right with me. As the years went on, I watched Sarah grow more integral to the business. She became my father's right hand, handling meetings and scheduling, sometimes even sitting in on the high-level strategic discussions that I thought were reserved for me. It wasn't that I didn't respect her. In fact, I could see she had potential. But my father had never trusted anyone like this before, not in all the years he ran the company. I started to wonder if he had plans for her that didn't involve me. I remember one evening, just a few months before his 90th birthday, I was in my office late, looking over some financial reports when I saw Sarah walking down the hall. She was carrying a stack of papers and had that look in her eyes, focused, determined. I couldn't help but feel like something was off. My mind kept racing, thinking, this can't be happening. My father wouldn't. He wouldn't give this company away to her, would he? But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that my time was slipping away. For the longest time, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that Sarah was just a passing phase, someone my father had taken a liking to because she was sharp. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't escape the thought that this was no longer about just running the company. It was about something more, something that didn't involve me at all. By the time my father's 90th birthday rolled around, I had already begun to feel like an outsider in my own company. The employees, the board members, they all seemed to respect Sarah in ways they never did with me. It was as if I had become invisible in the very place I had built from the ground up. It stung more than I care to admit. Still, I kept my head down. I kept working. Because in my heart, I knew the day would come when my father would make his decision, and when he did, I believed, no, I knew, that he would pass the torch to me. After all, I had earned it. All those years, all the sacrifices I made, the countless late nights spent working while my friends were out enjoying themselves. This was my time, my legacy, my inheritance. That was the dream anyway. It had been my dream for so long that I could hardly imagine anything else. The business was my life, my family, my future. I had dedicated everything to it. As my father's 90th birthday approached, I began to notice more subtle, yet concerning changes in the way he was managing the business. It wasn't anything drastic at first, but the signs were unmistakable. The man who had once been a powerhouse, driving the company with unrelenting energy and vision, was no longer the same. I couldn't pinpoint it exactly at first, but it was clear that something was shifting. His health had started to deteriorate. He had begun to show signs of forgetfulness and physical frailty. But even more alarming was his shift in behavior toward the family business, the company he had built from the ground up. His attention seemed to be waning. I had worked alongside him for over 2 decades, watched as he built this company, and then slowly handed over responsibilities to me. For a while, it seemed as though I was being groomed to take over, and I was ready. But as the years went by, I started to see cracks forming in what I thought was a solid plan. It wasn't just his health that concerned me. It was his increasing reliance on Sarah, my younger sister. It began innocently enough at first. Sarah had always been sharp, with a knack for understanding new technologies and emerging markets. She was respected, and I understood why my father had turned to her for insights into the modern landscape of business. But as time went on, it was as if my father was starting to trust her more than me. I began noticing the shift during our company retreat about a year ago. While the rest of us, me, my brother, and some key executives, were engaged in heated discussions about the company's future, my father spent more and more time with Sarah. He'd pull her aside to talk privately, ask for her opinions on major decisions, and nod approvingly whenever she spoke. And it wasn't just the fact that he was listening to her. It was the fact that the rest of the company seemed to listen to her too. It was a subtle shift, but it was undeniable. I watched as my father increasingly turned to Sarah for answers and approval, even during high-stakes meetings with the board. It wasn't just her sharp intellect that set her apart. There was something else. The respect that she commanded from the new generation of employees, the younger executives, was something I couldn't ignore. It was clear that she was becoming the face of the future, and I couldn't help but wonder if my place in the company was being sidelined. The tipping point came when I confronted my father about his plans for the future of the business. I had expected a conversation about succession, something that had been implied for years, something that I had always believed would eventually happen. But when I asked him directly if he was planning to hand over the reins to me, his answer was vague. He smiled, but there was a certain distance in his eyes. Instead of giving me a clear response, he told me that the company had to adapt to changing times, that the future was uncertain, and that it was essential to have new leadership to navigate these challenges. The words felt empty. It was as if he had already made up his mind without telling me. The more I thought about that conversation, the more I realized that the company was moving away from me, just as the trust between me and my father was slowly eroding. It wasn't just that Sarah was getting more involved. It was that my father was becoming less and less involved with me. The late-night meetings between my father and Sarah, the conversations that I was no longer part of, began to feel like a quiet declaration of the future, a future where I didn't seem to fit. It was disorienting. I had spent my entire adult life building this company alongside my father, watching him lead us through thick and thin. I had made sacrifices, pushed myself to the limit, and I had always believed that one day the company would be mine to carry forward. But now, that future seemed increasingly uncertain. Every time my father spoke about the direction the company was taking, it was as though he was speaking to Sarah, not me. He spoke about innovation, about change, about new opportunities, but all of it seemed to center around her. I could feel the resentment building inside me. It was impossible not to. There was Sarah, in her early 30s, moving through the company as if she were born for this role. She had ideas, yes, but so did I. She was skilled, but so was I. Yet, somehow, I had become the second choice. And worse, I was starting to feel like an outsider in my own family's company. What hurt the most was how quickly things had changed. One day, I was my father's trusted right-hand man, working alongside him on important decisions. And the next, I was on the periphery, watching as Sarah took center stage. The more I observed her rise, the more I felt like I was being phased out. She was taking on responsibilities that I had always expected to inherit, leading meetings, making critical decisions, representing the company at high-profile events. I tried to remind myself that she was competent, that she deserved her place, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. It felt personal. It felt like my father had already chosen who would take the company forward. I began to question whether I had missed something. Had I failed to prove myself in some way? Had I done something to cause this shift in my father's trust? I spent sleepless nights going over our conversations, our family history, wondering if the choices I'd made had somehow led me to this point. And all the while, Sarah seemed to grow more and more entrenched in the business, her influence expanding with every passing day. The fear that I was losing everything I had worked for became an all-consuming thought. The fear that my father's legacy would pass to her, and not me, was a constant companion. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, one that gnawed at me, even as I tried to maintain a sense of professionalism. I had dedicated my life to this company, and yet I was being left behind, a spectator in a drama that I thought I was meant to star in. As the months passed, I realized that the family business, the one I had always thought was my future, might no longer have a place for me. As my suspicions and frustrations continued to grow, they couldn't stay buried for long. The tension between Sarah and me began to show, and the subtle undercurrents of resentment finally bubbled to the surface. It all came to a head one evening, after a particularly difficult board meeting. My father had once again spoken about the importance of adapting to new technologies and markets, and it was clear that his vision for the future was deeply intertwined with Sarah's role in the company. I was struggling to maintain my composure as I listened to him sing her praises once more, but I couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation growing unbearable. That night, Sarah and I found ourselves alone in the conference room after everyone else had left. The silence between us was thick, heavy with the words neither of us had been willing to say until now. I couldn't hold back any longer. I confronted her about the way things had changed. I asked her directly why she seemed to be getting all the opportunities that I had expected to come my way, and why our father was increasingly placing his trust in her. At first, Sarah tried to deflect the conversation, trying to brush it off as if it was nothing more than a misunderstanding. She told me that I was overthinking things, that it wasn't about her or me, but about the company. She claimed that she was simply offering her insights to our father and the board because of her unique perspective on the evolving business landscape. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew this was far from the truth. I didn't let her off the hook. I pushed her, and as I did, her calm demeanor started to crack. She admitted that, yes, our father had been relying on her more, and she justified it by saying that the company needed fresh ideas. "You're more like Dad, Edward," she said. "You see the company as it was, not as it needs to be." Those words hit me hard, harder than I expected. Was she suggesting that my experience, my knowledge, was outdated? That the hard work and years I had spent by our father's side didn't matter anymore? The conversation grew more heated as we exchanged words that we had been holding back for years. Sarah accused me of being stuck in the past, of failing to recognize that the company needed to evolve if it was going to survive. She said that I wasn't as adaptable as she was, that my reluctance to embrace change was holding the company back. My frustration boiled over, and I told her that she wasn't the one who had dedicated her entire life to the company. I had worked my ass off, sacrificed countless personal moments, and put everything I had into ensuring the business continued to thrive. That night, the conversation became more than just about the company. It became about the family. Sarah and I were no longer just colleagues. We were siblings with a history, and that history was suddenly front and center. I accused her of playing a game to get ahead, of using our father's health and his changing attitude as leverage to secure her future at the expense of mine. The words I said were harsh, things I would regret, but they came from a place of deep hurt. Sarah, in turn, accused me of not seeing the bigger picture, of clinging to outdated notions of leadership. "It's not about you, Edward," she said. "It's about the company, and if you can't see that, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here anymore." The words stung, but they were also a wake-up call. It became clear that we were both fighting for the same thing, control over our father's legacy. But we saw that legacy differently. For Sarah, the future was about change and innovation. For me, It was about preserving the values that our father had built the company on. We were no longer speaking the same language. That night marked the beginning of a deeper divide in our family. What had once been a family-run business, with all its complexities and nuances, was now a battleground. And the worst part was that our father, the man who had always been the glue holding everything together, was no longer in a position to mediate. His silence in the face of the growing tension only made things worse. In the days that followed, I found myself retreating into my own thoughts, trying to process everything. My relationship with Sarah had changed. We were no longer the siblings who had grown up together in the company, learning the ropes side by side. Now, every conversation felt like a negotiation, a silent competition for the company's future. I couldn't help but wonder if our father had intentionally set us on this path. Had he seen this divide coming? Had he been grooming Sarah for leadership all along, knowing that I would struggle to adapt to the new vision of the business? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my relationship with my father and with Sarah might never be the same again. And as the company moved forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing everything I had worked for. The family drama had escalated, and now, more than ever, I felt like an outsider in my own home and my own business. The weeks that followed the conversation with Sarah were like a slow-motion unraveling of everything I had known. What had started as a small crack in our relationship soon expanded into a deep and growing chasm. Once, we were partners in this journey, but now it felt like we were on opposite sides of an invisible line, with no chance of reconciliation in sight. What had once been subtle disagreements had transformed into open animosity, and every encounter with Sarah was like walking into a battlefield where the weapons were sharp words and silent contempt. Before, I had always been able to count on Sarah's support. She was my sister, after all. We had grown up together, learned the ropes of the business together, and dreamed of taking the company to new heights together. But now, those days felt like a distant memory, replaced by a tense and uncomfortable silence whenever we were in the same room. Sarah was no longer the eager young woman who had admired me. She was now a woman who saw me as an obstacle to her own success. Her passive-aggressive comments became a regular feature of our interactions. Every suggestion I made, no matter how well thought out, was met with an almost mocking response. Even more painful were the glances she exchanged with our father during meetings, the subtle, almost smug looks that spoke volumes. It was clear that she had already positioned herself as the future leader of the company, and I was merely a bystander in my own story. I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. I had worked my entire life for this position. I had invested countless hours making sacrifices, learning every detail about the company, building relationships with our clients, and securing investors. I had earned my place in this world, or at least I thought I had. Now it seemed as though all of that had been for nothing. My experience, my hard work, and my dedication had been overshadowed by Sarah's ambition, and worse, by our father's apparent favoring of her over me. The frustration and confusion only deepened when I began to notice subtle changes within the company itself. Our meetings, once filled with my contributions and ideas, began to feel like I was being sidelined. My father, whom I had always looked to for guidance and support, was increasingly distant, and when I tried to discuss my concerns with him, his responses were vague and unsatisfactory. It felt as though he had already made up his mind about Sarah's future, and no matter how hard I tried to convince him that I was still the right person for the job, it was clear that his heart was no longer in it. Every decision seemed to reinforce the idea that Sarah was the chosen one. In some ways, I understood the reasoning. Sarah had a different vision for the company. She was bold, innovative, and had a drive that was undeniable. But that didn't mean that I had no place in this company, no purpose. I had spent years building something solid, a foundation upon which the future could be built. I had helped secure the relationships that had sustained the business. And now, I was being told that everything I had worked for no longer mattered. I tried to reach out to my mother, hoping she could offer some perspective or guidance. But she was hesitant, unwilling to take sides. I didn't blame her. She had her own fears about what was happening within the family. But that only made me feel more isolated. I couldn't talk to Sarah about it. Every time we spoke, the tension was palpable, and it was clear that any conversation would turn into a heated argument. My father was no help, and my mother was unwilling to intervene. It was as if everyone was watching the family fracture from the sidelines, too afraid to step in. It was during this time that I began to question my own role in all of this. Was I too rigid in my thinking? Had I failed to see the changes coming? I had always believed that hard work and loyalty were enough to secure one's place in this world. But Sarah's rise seemed to suggest that maybe it wasn't. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe I had failed to recognize that the future of the company was always meant to be in Sarah's hands. But even as I questioned myself, there was a part of me that couldn't let go. The company wasn't just a job. It was part of who I was. It was a reflection of my identity, my legacy. To leave now, to step away and watch someone else take over what I had helped to build, seemed like an impossible thing to do. I was so deeply intertwined with the business that the idea of leaving felt like tearing apart a piece of my soul. What would I even be without the company? Would I still be Edward, the man who had spent his life building something meaningful? Or would I simply be a man adrift, a man whose identity had been swallowed up by the very thing he had once loved? The more I struggled with these thoughts, the more I felt a sense of inevitability creeping in. Perhaps Sarah was meant to take over. Perhaps the company was no longer mine to lead. But even as I contemplated this possibility, the idea of stepping aside filled me with dread. What did it mean for me if I lost everything I had worked for? What would I be without the company that had been my life's work? As the fracture between Sarah and me grew wider, I began to see that there might be no way to repair it. Every time we interacted, every time we spoke, the distance between us became more pronounced. We weren't just business partners anymore. We were rivals, competitors in a game where only one could win. And no matter how hard I tried to push against it, I knew that I was losing. The family I had known, the company I had built, were slipping away from me. It was as if everything I had fought for had been for nothing. And no matter what I did, I couldn't seem to stop the inevitable descent into chaos. The dream of a united family working together for the future had already been shattered. Now, it was just about survival. Would I find a way to carve out a future for myself outside of the business? Or would I lose everything that had ever mattered to me? As the fracture deepened, I could feel the walls closing in, and I had no idea how to stop it. As the days went by, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the reality of the situation. I had spent so much time convincing myself that things could still be salvaged, that if I just worked harder, if I just found the right words, the situation could somehow be fixed. But the truth was undeniable. The situation had spiraled beyond repair, and the more I resisted that truth, the more futile it became to hold on to the hope that things would go back to the way they were. My relationship with Sarah had disintegrated to the point where even the smallest interaction was filled with tension. The hurtful comments, the passive-aggressive jabs, the unspoken resentment, it had all built up to a point where there was no longer any room for understanding or compromise. I had tried to reach out to her, to explain that I was not her enemy, that I only wanted what was best for the company, but it had all fallen on deaf ears. She no longer saw me as a brother or partner. I was simply a roadblock standing in her way. And that realization was like a slap in the face, one that I couldn't ignore anymore. I also began to see how my own actions had contributed to the growing divide. I had become so focused on protecting what I thought was mine, my legacy, my role in the company, that I failed to see Sarah's potential. She had grown into a capable and ambitious leader in her own right, and I had spent far too much time viewing her as competition rather than someone who could help lead the company to new heights. But in my mind, I was still the one who had paid my dues, who had earned the right to lead. I couldn't shake the feeling that my father had abandoned me in favor of Sarah, and no matter how much I tried to prove myself, it felt as if I was always one step behind. But even as I confronted these uncomfortable truths, I couldn't help but feel anger rising inside me. Anger at Sarah for what she had become, anger at my father for choosing her over me, and anger at myself for not seeing this coming sooner. The anger was overwhelming, and it clouded my judgment. I wanted to lash out, to confront Sarah and my father, to demand answers and clarity. But a part of me knew that it would only make things worse. The damage had already been done, and no amount of shouting or confrontation would fix what was broken. I couldn't escape the feeling that everything I had worked for was slipping away from me. The company that had been my life's work was no longer mine to control, and I could feel it. Every meeting I attended, every decision that was made, it was all happening without me. I was no longer at the center of it all. The very thing I had built, the very thing I had sacrificed so much for, was being slowly but surely taken away. The realization hit me hard. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was about something much larger than that. The company was at a crossroads, and I had no place in its future. I had been fighting for a position that no longer existed, holding on to a vision that was no longer relevant. The dream of working side by side with my sister, of building something together, had been shattered, and now I was forced to confront the truth that the future of the company was in Sarah's hands, not mine. It was in these moments of reflection that I began to realize how deeply I had identified with the company. I had poured everything into it, my time, my energy, my identity. I had built it up from the ground, and to see it slip away was like losing a part of myself. The company had been more than just a business to me. It had been my life's work, the thing that defined me. Now it was slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it. I tried to focus on other aspects of my life. I tried to find solace in things outside of the business, but nothing seemed to fill the void. The truth was, I had no backup plan. My entire identity had been tied to the company, and now that it was no longer mine to lead, I was lost. What did I do now? What was my purpose if not to lead this company, to continue the legacy I had started? I began to entertain the possibility of leaving the company entirely. Maybe it was time for me to start fresh, to find something else to do with my life. But the idea of walking away felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that everything I had worked for was for nothing. I wasn't sure I could do that. It felt like a betrayal of everything I had built and everything I had worked for. But even as I struggled with these conflicting emotions, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was time to face the truth. Sarah was the future. The company was hers to lead. I had to find a way to come to terms with that reality, even if it meant stepping aside and letting go of something I had held onto for so long. This was the reckoning I had been avoiding for so long. The point where I had to confront the fact that the world was changing, and my role in it was no longer what I had imagined. It was a painful, soul-crushing realization, but it was one that I could no longer ignore. The truth was clear now. It was time for me to step aside. The company, the legacy, and the future, none of it was mine to control anymore, and accepting that would be the hardest thing I had ever done. Standing there, I realized it was time to accept my new reality. The company was no longer mine to control, and Sarah was the future of it. I had spent so much time defining myself by my role, but clinging to the past was only holding me back. It was time to let go and move forward. Though it was difficult, I began to understand that my identity wasn't tied solely to the company. I was still Edward, capable, experienced, and driven.